Okay, welcome everyone. Greetings. I'd like to welcome you to our panel, morning time in North Carolina. Thank you so much for joining us for this morning panel of Art History 2060, Imagining Our Futures to Rethink Our Pasts. I'm John Corso-Esquivel, an Associate Professor of Art History at Davidson College, and I would like to welcome you to this morning's panel. Today, these accomplished emerging scholars will share with us the methodologies that they anticipate will come to define and expand the discipline. This is the final event in the C3 New Scholars Symposium program, and I'll offer additional thanks at our in-person events, but I would like to thank the Creating Connections Consortium for providing a generous grant to fund this event. Thanks to Associate Dean and Professor of Anthropology, Heriberto Lozada, Art Department Chair, Court Savage, all of my Art Department colleagues, both faculty and staff, and thanks to Professor Emerita Nina Serebrennikov, who completed much of the work for this grant application before her retirement. And thanks especially to our outstanding panelists for joining us from different locations on 3 continents. Just a word about the format. We will have 4 presentations this morning, and I will introduce each panelist directly before they present their papers. I encourage you to use the Q&A function to post questions. We'll monitor those questions and pose as many as possible to the panelists at the end of the session. We'll end our program at approximately 11:35 Eastern Time. Gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Adekunle Adeyemo is a Gerda Henkel PhD Fellow in the Department of Architecture at Obafemi Awolowo University in Ile-Ife, Nigeria. His research on modern architecture and Ariel Sharon's Obafemi Awolowo University campus. His paper is entitled Architectural History 2060, Digital World, Digital Evidence, Digital History. Okay, please join me in welcoming Adekunle. Thank you.
Yeah, good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen so that we can kick off with the presentation. Okay, as John just said, excuse me, just a moment. Share screen. Yeah. I hope you can all see my screen now. Hello, hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we see your screen well, thank you.
All right, so let me proceed. So I am, as John just introduced me, I'm Adekunle Olusola Adeyemo. I'm a Gerda Henkel PhD Fellow in the Department of Architecture of Obafemi University, and I'm presenting a paper today. The title is Digital Architectural History 2060, Digital World, Digital Evidence, Digital History. First, I'll give an overview of the presentation. I'll begin with an introduction of the presentation before I proceed to speak about architectural history, then discuss the emerging digital age. After this, I'll then attempt to sketch a conceptual framework for a digital architectural history in the digital age, and thereafter conclude. By way of introduction, the aim of this presentation is to theorize how architectural history will be practiced in the year 2060. So the fundamental question is, which I'll be attempting to answer, is how would architectural history be practiced 40 years from now? For this, I've employed a polemic approach based on a critical appraisal of the methods and tools in architectural history and the trajectory of the emerging digital age. We can ask ourselves, what is architectural history? According to Andrew Leach, architectural history is a field of study that draws on the widespread general interest and investment in architecture, monuments, and cities, while being subject at a professional and academic level to disciplinary rigors. It is an inquiry into the past of architecture that pays varying degrees of attention to its usefulness for those who make architecture. Of course, there's a widespread general interest in architecture such that it is the subject of discussion in the society, in the media, at various settings, sometimes even in journalism. Pieces of architecture, monuments, and cities have even been valorized. But at best, this can only be seen as architectural appreciation. There are disciplinary rigors which architectural history is subject to, rigors from the field of history, from the field of art history, and those from architecture. I'll broach upon a few of these. And one of it is the essence of architectural history. Understanding the essence of architectural history will illuminate the basis of assessing it, which will in turn help in guiding our comprehension of its present and future practice. In his seminal work, The Rise of Architectural History, David Watkin explicated the essence of architectural history as threefold. First, the practical. The practical in architectural history is to convey what was built, when was it built, and the names of the patron and the designer. The second is the historical. And this aspect of architectural history is to discover why it was built, and which requires religious, cultural, and sociological knowledge, because the precise function of a building may not be as obvious as it might first be imagined. And the third is the aesthetic. And this part of architectural history's essence is to account for the visual and stylistic differences between one building and another, and the associated stylistic thinking. However, as Watkin also acknowledges, architectural historians have not always applied themselves simultaneously to these three things, the practical, the historical, and the aesthetic, with the same rigor, meaning that they often focus on one or the other. Another thing to consider is the methodological approaches to architectural history. And examining the methodological approaches will make us understand that architectural history is not just about buildings, but about all that is within the field of architecture. And although many historians have elucidated the approaches to architectural history, the six outlined by Andrew Leach seem to encapsulate them all. And the first is the style and period. This division of architectural history into a chronology governed by style and period is one of the first, more traditional and most enduring approaches, where architecture is historicized through the lens of style or period. That is, the style or the period in which the architecture was made. And this can be traceable to Hegel's Zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age, where the architecture is seen as an expression of the spirit of the age. So we talk about Renaissance architecture, Gothic architecture, and the likes. The next Andrew Leach talked about is biography, and the tradition of writing biographical portraits of artists, including some identified as architects, is offered an important model for academic architectural history beginning from the 19th century. And this resulted in the writing of what is called the architectural biography. Although the approach to writing contemporary histories about the architect has changed, it fundamentally still has divisions according to lifespan, and this discusses the practice trajectory and the works, the relationship of the architect with other biographical entities like the earlier modes. Sometimes it is also called the life and works journal of architectural history. It aims at highlighting the contribution of the individual architect to history. The history produced treats architecture as evidencing the architect's actions and intentions, while linking their life work to that of others by means of their formation, their motives, their influences, settings, opportunities, and professional and artistic genealogies. Another approach is geography and culture. And architectural histories that follow geography and culture borrow limits from geopolitical borders and map onto cultural territories. They often parallel characteristics of biographical histories. A nation's architectural history can be studied as a distinct field of knowledge, despite the obvious complications and compromises inevitable arising from the modern nation's border sharing, immigration, and emigration. It could also include formerly separate territories, which are now united in the nation, or discernible linguistic regions with coherent architectural histories within the larger nationalistic grouping and be subject to the mechanisms of colonialism. It's within this that we talk of colonial architecture. We also talk of architecture in diaspora. There is the history of type, the correlation between a building's form, character, and the organization, and its purpose led observers in the 18th and 19th centuries to regard architecture as analogous of many natural and cultural phenomena, such that it could be divided into families, which are understandable independent of history. Thus, they formed the typological approach, which were marriages of intellectual pragmatism, values with empirical division of buildings into categories, depending on how they appeared to work. In introducing a history of buildings types, Nicholas Pevsner suggested the need for typological knowledge of architectural history due to the broader scope of the architect's work beyond the domain of churches, castles, and palaces to a plethora of building types from the 19th century onwards. And so there are different types. And a historian that's tried to categorize them is Anthony Vidler, and he identified 3 types. There is those that can be closely tied to nature, which is Vidler's first typology. There are those related to their use, which is Vidler's second typology, or connected to reducing the buildings to architectural elements, which is Vidler's third typology. There are also histories of technique. The rise of technique as a methodological approach to architectural history can be traced to Renian Baham's assertion that histories of what architects do, which others do not, can be written, including work of proto-architects. Church histories see coherence in how architects consciously or otherwise deploy concepts over time, and other things architects do as a basis of architecture's disciplinarity. This frees the historian to tell the story of architecture without the shackles of the term's more recent conceptual and institutional history, meaning that we can trace the history of architecture even beyond the discipline of what we call architecture today, which is why we can talk of architecture without architects. These architectural histories can be considered as a history of technique, following Michael Foucault's concept of technique as a product of discourse, with further extensions to the history of technique within architecture and of architecture as a technique. Thus, they include architectural histories of tectonics, of drawing, of construction, of writing instructions, and other similar things within the purview of what architects do. A final category identified by Andrew Leach is theme and analogy. Thematic and analogical histories of architecture, unlike those of other approaches that rely on historical continuities, constructible, internal to architecture, in thematic and analogical histories, they reference concrete and abstract relationships between architecture and its exterior. Thematic histories seek coincidences between architecture and other kinds of historical activity, between buildings and their uses, and they engage architectural ideas and themes which have consequences beyond architecture. Analogous histories, however, explore conceptual devices which allow architectural history to contribute new viewpoints on issues beyond architecture. Such histories may, for example, seek analogous relationships between architecture and technology, politics, society, medicine, and such other fields, aiming to contribute usefully to them. Thematic and analogous histories align with the late 20th century architectural culture writing genre called architectural theory. Of course, one very popular one is Architecture and Modernity by Hilda Hennen. Next, I talk about evidence in architectural history. According to Linda Groth and David Wang, there are 4 types of evidence in architectural history. There is the determinative evidence, which locates the object of study in a particular time and particular place. We talk about the dates of the design and construction of the buildings, the measurements of the buildings, historical photographs, and the such. There's also contextual evidence, which are due to the social and cultural factors that are synchronic to the artifact under study, because they provide the context of the architecture. It is a further step beyond determinative evidence because the synchronic social and cultural factors are established after the dates of the architectural buildings or persons are known. There's also inferential evidence which build on the determinative and contextual evidence and reasoned interpretation to posit a fact as likely to be linked with another, although hard connections of determinative and contextual nature may not be available. Finally, we have the recollective evidence, and is the type of evidence that an informant supplies during an interview. It often involves all the previous kinds of evidence, as it can provide determinative information such as dates, contextual information, since it also has inferential evidence because the interviewee makes inferences about facts in the past. The sources of evidence in architectural history are the buildings, the archives, which provide documents and drawings, and the archives could be private archives, could be government archives, institutional archives, or and such. There is also oral history. Let me quickly move on to the digital age. In looking at the digital age, the signs that the digital age is emerging are all around us. We all use social media. We purchase things online, which is e-commerce. We hold online meetings. We communicate using emails. Social media is even now used for official communication, such that governments even use Twitter, and organizations also do. Many people use online diaries and planners today instead of using physical diaries. All the data from our online activities are on the internet or the World Wide Web, a system that links all computers in the world. These days, almost all organizations have websites, and individuals also have websites or blogs. All these show a trend that most of the information about what goes on today can be found on the internet, which is digital media. So in the digital age, by 2060, we'll be fully in that age. There will be archives containing our digital footprints accessible on the World Wide Web. For example, you can retrieve an email you received or sent 20 years ago now. Your digital footprints will include your activities on websites and blogs, email communication, social media activities, and commercial activities. Today, we have a lot of information on the internet of conferences, of exhibitions, events held far back at the beginning of the 20th century, but they were uploaded after the invention of the World Wide Web by Sir Tim Berners-Lee in 1989. In the future, there's no need to upload the information because they were executed, organized, or supported online, so all the information is already there. The future archives will be in digital repositories, just like we have physical archives today. And the evidence from the digital archives will be acceptable in the academia, just as the evidence from physical archives are acceptable today. One can imagine that we will have digital repositories or archives or libraries containing the World Wide Web or internet records of the ages before. Individuals and collectives will possess digital personalities and digital identities that are understandable from the digital archives. And this is essential in what would follow, which we will now discuss. Based on the methods and tools of architectural history and the emerging digital age, a digital history will be in play by the year 2060. The essential changes of the digital architectural history compared to our present-day architectural history will indicate shifts in three principal things: in the evidence, in the analysis, and the presentation. This I will look at. First, in terms of the evidence, architectural history traditionally relies on archival records as evidence, in addition to the buildings and oral history. But in the evolving digital world, fewer physical diaries and documents are kept. Some buildings may no longer exist and interview subjects dead. So in terms of evidence, digital architectural history will involve a shift in what is acceptable as evidence. Data from the World Wide Web repositories will be acceptable as evidence for which a referencing method will have been adopted. Referencing styles such as APA, Chicago, and Oxford will have developed a way to cite from the digital archives as they would then be taken as authentic literature. For example, today, there are audio recordings of historical interviews, which of course is a trend that is obviously going to continue. Digital tools will be used to collect data from these repositories, just like we have Google as a search engine now. Data about buildings, even those that have been destroyed, can be exhumed from online records, including maps and photographs. This will grant more access to evidence beyond present-day boundaries. Instead of storing physically, digital media will be used to store the evidence. Whereas architects and architectural firms had drawings stored physically up till now, they will then be stored in their website archives. In the analysis of the evidence, there will also be changes. Digital tools will allow for broader frames of analysis. Before now, architectural historians were limited by their experience, what they have seen or read, so that the more read or experienced they were, the more they can identify and hence historicize elements and buildings. Thus, they are often limited to describing the form of the building or analyzing it only visually, unable to employ the correct terminology or to trace the source. What happens is that more experienced co-authors, peer reviewers, or supervisors would direct the architectural historian to the literature or to the source. Today, with software applications like Google Lens, you can identify and trace the source of a document or image, but this is itself limited by the source data. In the digital age, there will be tools to trace the origins of signs, of symbols, of objects, of motifs, and other things that aid the understanding of architectural history. Archived 2- and 3-dimensional images and animations will be used to compare the way the buildings are finished and used with what was designed. The cultural frame usually employed in historicizing architecture in non-Western concepts will be instructive in analyzing personalities and identities and their corresponding architecture, as the digital evidence will illuminate the culture of the patrons and the society. For example, you can understand people, their taste of buildings, attitudes, values, and preferences through their Instagram posts. We can know what people value through their social media history, what people count significant enough to be worthy of presentation to the public, or maybe even worthy of preservation will be by how referenced these things are on social media. We'll be able to understand the society social media trends. Machine learning will facilitate digital reconstruction of images and buildings in 2 and 3 dimensions, and which is essential to understanding this. For example, Crystal Palace, which was built in 1851 and destroyed in 1936, can be reconstructed using digital tools. The architectural historian can use the digital reconstruction to experience the building in order to historicize it. Today, there's a lot of architectural history videos on YouTube. So the presentation of digital architectural history will surpass this, as it will involve the use of digital media and immersive technology, including virtual reality. One could be taken inside and around the building while the historian narrates its history. In conclusion, by examining the methods and the tools of architectural history and the trajectory of the evolving digital age, I've sketched a conceptual framework for digital architectural history, or an architectural history in a digital age. Given that the features of the evolving digital world indicate that there will be fundamental redefinitions of how architectural history is practiced, the need to refocus architectural history in preparation for these shifts is apparent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful way to begin our morning panel. Thanks so much. Next, we will hear from Jamie Rose Valera. I will introduce Jamie right now. Jamie is a first-year master's student at Boston University, where she is continuing her studies in the history of art and architecture. Most recently, her research investigates the effects of NFTs, cryptocurrency, and blockchain technology in the arts. Outside of academia, Valera's work can be found in various arts and culture publications. Her paper today is called The Art of the Non-Fungible Token, Collecting and Curating. Welcome, Jamie.
Good morning, everyone. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. So I am very happy to be here today and talk to you all about NFTs. Often when I chat with colleagues about NFTs, we think of the here and now, and how could we not when there has been so much talk around this very new subject. However, despite all the current buzz around NFTs, it's been rather rare that I have a discussion with someone regarding the future of NFTs specifically, let alone the role of NFTs in the year 2060. As of today, there's only ever been one instance where I have gone down this very deep rabbit hole, and it was with two individuals, one of whom is a current doctoral student researching artificial intelligence and network science, and the other being a postdoctorate fellow in computer and information technology. The three of us had met at, of all places, a talk being given by a clinical psychologist. Now, I bring up this story because I believe in the notion that innovation happens at the intersection of disciplines. And when it comes to NFTs, I think they are quite literally the epitome of the crossing between arts, sciences, and technology. So for a brief moment, I'd like for you to think about what you think an NFT is. Is there something in particular that comes to mind? And if so, does it look something along the lines of this? This is a Bored Ape Yacht Club NFT. So maybe you didn't imagine this exact Bored Ape, but you may have thought of some variety of it. After all, it is a collection of 10,000 unique Bored Ape NFTs, all of whom live on something called the Ethereum blockchain. So surprisingly, as I was researching this collection, these NFTs grant you access to certain parties and events, which arguably would make these a very expensive admission ticket to these events. But nonetheless, maybe you didn't think of something like this. Maybe you thought of something more pixelated, perhaps. You may have encountered these CryptoPunks, as they're called, as profile pictures for people's social media. In fact, so many of these have been used as digital avatars that Mark Zuckerberg recently announced as of 2 days ago, prior to this presentation, that NFTs will soon be available on the Instagram platform. Similarly, you may have also seen the previous Bored Apes as someone's profile photo, although the Bored Apes tend to be the more popular poster child, so to speak, for mass media. And speaking of mass media, maybe you didn't even think of an image like these. Maybe instead you imagined the many headlines that mention NFTs. Often these pieces will highlight the financial aspects of an NFT, such as this New York Times article that reads, how much real money can you make from virtual art? So what you might not realize, though, is that with other pieces such as this, like the Time magazine cover and issue regarding this crypto figures commentary, what you might not realize is that this specific Time magazine cover and issue is in fact an NFT. In fact, it's fully interactive and you can read the commentary from this crypto figure inside. But now you might be wondering, how exactly is this Time magazine NFT any different from their issues published on, let's say, Amazon Kindle? And why is it specifically this one is an NFT, but not the rest? So to understand this, we need to first clearly define what an NFT is precisely. As the name suggests, an NFT is a non-fungible token, and non-fungible tokens are cryptographic assets on a blockchain with unique identification codes and metadata that distinguish them from each other. Put more simply, and not using much computer science jargon, an NFT can be anything digital or digitized, but even more importantly is the fact that it must live on something called a blockchain, which we can go into this technology in a moment, but for now, what you need to know are a couple of things regarding NFTs. First, NFTs can technically represent or be tied to a real-world asset or an object, such as an artwork. Second, they often come with something called smart contracts, but more on this in a bit as well. Now, because they live on the blockchain, they cannot be replicated, for lack of a better phrasing. Typically, due to the blockchain of an NFT, the practices of buying, trading, and authenticating these assets significantly reduce the probability of fraud or tampered data. So now that we have an understanding of what an NFT is, what exactly is a blockchain then? And why does it differentiate an NFT image from any random JPEG file on the internet? So imagine again for a moment that a company stores sensitive account info for all their clients or users. Feel free to use any company that is in real life or one that you just made up, but for all intensive purposes, that info is stored on a physical server inside a warehouse. Now, what happens if that warehouse suddenly loses electricity? What if it was demolished by a fire? Or arguably worse, what if it was hacked and the data was stolen or tampered with? As you can imagine, that data would be lost or corrupted, and that company would very likely suffer some hefty lawsuits. Similarly, a blockchain is a database, but without these flaws in security. So how exactly does a imaginary server warehouse differ from the blockchain precisely? So a blockchain is also a database, but it's a distributed one that is shared among the many nodes of its computer network. So when new data or information is being recorded, it must first be validated prior to linking to the last block of information and therefore being archived, hence the name blockchain. Because these smart contracts permit transactions and terms, a buyer and seller could remain anonymous if they wanted, and they wouldn't need some form of external enforcement or third party, which smart contracts are often associated with NFTs and are also stored on the blockchain. In art speak, a collector could approach an artist directly without the legal need of a gallery. The artist still could work with a gallery, but with NFTs in place and blockchains. So the artist could then lay out their terms on their own and have full autonomous and legal rights over the transaction. There are various blockchains such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others, but Bitcoin is known to be very inefficient due to its inherent security protocols. Whereas Ethereum, for instance, has also been a popular choice for hosting NFTs, smart contracts, and their exchanges and transactions. So now that we have a sampling of NFTs and their assorted blockchains and smart contracts, what exactly are their uses? So there are several applications for NFTs and the technology of blockchains, but some of these uses are tied together, such as their sense of provenance and transparency. Because of how blockchains operate, all of that archived information is trackable and it's public. You would just need to learn how to read these things like hash codes, identification codes for an image or for whatever the NFT is. In fact, they are so well maintained, you could view the transactions and exchanges in real time, both unverified and verified ones. So when data is being recorded, it must first be validated prior to linking to the last block of info, like I had mentioned earlier. But let's say, for instance, that someone wants to steal an NFT and redirect its route to be delivered to a different collector or a different wallet. They would need to control the majority or 51% of all computers currently on the network. So that copy, because it's tampered, it would not match with all the other copies on the network. And this is something called proof of work. Essentially, let's say instead you want to steal an NFT directly from the source, because your copy of that information of that transaction does not match everyone else's or the majority, your transaction would be invalidated and the whole thing would just be called off. But let's say you wanted to go straight to the source. Let's say you wanted to take someone's NFT directly from them and not in the middle of a transaction. You would need the specific key to that person's wallet. So that key can be any random string of words or phrases, and it's usually anything between 10 to 20 phrases or words. And as long as that random string of words and phrases or key is stored offline on paper or memorized by the original wallet holder, they're the only ones who can access that wallet. So if you lose your key as the original holder, you also lose access to your wallet. Now, when it comes to copyrights and the digital art realm, this could pose as a potential solution to art fraud, specifically regarding ownership and authenticity. Now, these are uses specifically for institutions and collectors mainly, but what about for the artist? One of the most attractive traits of an NFT to the artist is the smart contract. An artist could say, for example, that every time their NFT is resold, they receive a cut of that sale. This essentially creates a source of stable income for the artist and provides a sense of financial independence and sustainability. So imagine for a moment that you are a museum or individual who collects vintage baseball cards. These must first be authenticated, possibly conserved, minted, and then finally delivered to you as the buyer. With an NFT version, you wouldn't need to spend nearly as much time on the authentication, the conservation, or the transportation of that baseball card. This has the potential for massive archives and databases who could utilize NFT technologies to provide better accessibility to their collections for researchers. Removed or deaccessioned works already retire as bits of data on a museum's database to begin with, and they may even become lost or misinterpreted with time as new staff work with the records or as updates to the system occur. While there would be, of course, funding and rendering and programming needs, so far, many pop culture organizations have already experimented with this potential. Take, for instance, this Marvel comic from 2004 of the X-Men franchise. Now, keep in mind, this is a screen recording off of an iPhone that is being streamed to you via Zoom and this presentation. So whatever monitor you're on, this video is not exactly going to do it justice in terms of resolution, but for demonstration's sake, you can see that just through the camera of a smartphone, this NFT is legible and interactive through the use of virtual reality, something that has already been closely associated with the collecting of NFTs, but is not necessary. Although the introduction of virtual reality to the viewing experience isn't something new, especially when considering that Google Arts and Culture and art museums have already been using VR well before the mainstream use of NFTs. So because blockchains significantly reduce all of the processes involved with collecting an artwork or an NFT, I suspect that rather than completely eliminating these roles of curators, archivists, etc., they would instead encourage adaptations. So while NFTs are decentralized, many tend to be backed by a community with a common interest. This might be something from pop culture, like the Marvel comics, but they can also be topics of social reform. World of Women is a thriving collective that celebrates equal opportunity, especially regarding artists or artworks who are not of the Western art historical canon. Woody's, among many other collectives, have also readily acknowledged the environmental concerns with NFTs and blockchains by working toward a net zero carbon emission rate or with a climate pledge. Now, ironically enough, despite the archival traits of NFTs, there isn't exactly a national archive that would allow researchers to make appointments and look at materials. In fact, your archive would be the blockchain itself because it's public and fully available. But there is another method of research, however, because NFTs, because they're the here and now and part of the foreseeable future, anything NFT related can be directed to the communities themselves who are very active online over Twitter or Discord. And Discord is essentially the better Skype according to video gamers and other pop culture groups. So think of Discord as a sort of popular alternative to Slack. Large groups of interested patrons, artists, or in this case, academics, can join a server where smaller rooms or channels are available for topics ranging from a general chat to a Q&A to news pieces regarding that collective, or to chat specifically for artists or collectors. These servers are run by moderators who I would say are probably the closest role to the traditional white cube curator or archivist. So if we think about the curatorial role specifically, one could imagine that maybe 5% is writing and researching about an artwork or collection, and 95% is project management with planning exhibitions or working with the collection. Moderators in these communities are extremely similar. One that I had joined for, of course, research purposes was that of the Seattle NFT Museum. This is the first museum in the entire world dedicated to NFTs and displaying them. And I was surprised to find that the moderator was none other than Peter Hamilton, one of the co-founders of the museum. While a curator in a traditional museum might engage directly with the public regarding exhibition planning by asking what they want to see through surveys, for instance, rarely do you actually see the same engagement with a top executive at one of these institutions. And yet this linear structure seems to be consistent among all the NFT communities that I have ever encountered. So going back to the 5% of writing and research that I had mentioned, provenance and proof of ownership could expedite how we authenticate a work in the curatorial sphere. Certificates of authenticity no longer have to be a single paper copy. You could have the paper trail if you wanted as a second version, but if you had an NFT copy, that artwork's provenance could be recorded and self-maintained by the blockchain and by all the computers currently on the network, which is possible due to the fact you don't have to actually put a price tag on an NFT. Exhibitions would become more immersive, so to speak, but they don't have to go completely into the virtual sphere. Like the NFT Art Museum, NFTs could be put on display with something like a high-resolution monitor. So if we think about the new media artist and designer, Rethink, he takes this idea of displaying NFTs to a whole new level. Anadol's projects use data-driven machine learning algorithms to render abstract environments. These often lively and moving images are displayed holographically with many 16K resolution projectors and other AV equipment. Not only has Anadol been accepted into the contemporary art scene by the art market or by institutions, but so have new buyers themselves. Christie's specifically reported that in 2021, they reached their best record of sales in the last 5 years. While 8% of these sales were made up of NFTs, 70% of these buyers were new and younger buyers, many of whom it seems were under the age of 40. So no longer are auction houses reserved for the top 1% in the world. So while there are drawbacks that are constantly improving, NFTs have created a new market and are beginning to redefine notions of originality, reproduction, authenticity, archives, and digital identity. But with these changes are new demographics and behaviors of future art collecting and curating. And so far, these seem to be for the better, despite being in an early beta stage. With such an active community and endless technological potential, I suspect that NFTs will introduce basically a new era of art history. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Jamie. I think that will probably serve as a great primer for us and spark a lot of conversations. I just wanted to pose one quick question to you from the Q&A. Joelle writes, great presentation. Would you please give us an update on NFT's significant environmental costs?
That is definitely a large criticism about NFTs. So as I mentioned, there are various blockchains regarding NFTs. So depending on which blockchain you're looking at, which one they're stored on and which one hosts the transaction, some are far more efficient than others, but some are also very problematic. Bitcoin, for instance, which is of course the most well-known cryptocurrency and blockchain, is very inefficient in this case. Ethereum seems to be the more popular choice because they are far more efficient in terms of the electric power needed to power the transaction and the exchange and the recording of that information. But there are certain blockchains that have been striving for this more eco-friendly way of producing these transactions and information. So Ethereum has been on that very actively. It's something called Ethereum 2.0. If you look into that, the developer specifically outlines these goals of theirs to reach a more efficient carbon emission rate.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to have a bunch of questions, I think, for the end on this. We'll hold off for a moment, but I really appreciate that. And Jason, we'll begin your presentation. I'd like to introduce Jason Vartikar, who is currently a Joan Tisch Teaching Fellow at the Whitney Museum and a PhD candidate in the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University, where he has been a recipient of the Jeanette and William Hayden Jones Fellowship in American Art and Culture since 2016. His writing on Ruth Asawa's early wire sculpture appeared in American Art, the Journal of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, which awarded his essay the Frost Prize Honorable Mention in 2021. He's currently writing his dissertation on melancholy, registered in 1915 to 1945, American Art, focusing on the paintings of Charles Birchfield and Edward Hopper. Today, his paper is an exercise in critical fabulation, Thomas Day's Rostrum of Resistance, Survivance, and Sentience. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, John. I'm going to turn off my my camera to get better bandwidth. I'm going to be addressing some sensitive material, so I want to make sure that my voice is coming through so that you hear what I'm intending to say. So please, if for some reason I start breaking up, let me know so that I can correct the technical issues. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see me or see the presentation? Yes, good. Okay, great. So I'll begin. This is an 1888 photograph of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Dialectic and Philanthropic Society Debate Hall. At first, this photograph seems to figure a moment of absence, a moment of no person there. Empty chairs face a group of lecterns on a raised platform known as a rostrum. Another lectern stands on the floor to the right of the rostrum, but no one seems to speak from this space designed for speech. Art Nouveau gas lighting modernizes the debate hall, implying that under the lights, speech may be imminent. Perhaps this is therefore a photograph imaging an absence at the podium, an absence in the audience, precisely because the commissioned photographer pictures the anticipation of speech, the availability of this debate hall. But who is the anticipated speaker? Is it the 1888 UNC gentry, the property white male Southerners for whom the space is queued? Or are these empty chairs facing empty lecterns somehow already occupied by a speaker? Perhaps the speaker is Thomas Day, the freeborn Black cabinet maker from Milton, North Carolina, who won the commission to make these lecterns and to renovate the debate hall in 1848, 40 years before this photograph was made. What might Thomas Day have to say? What might these lecterns voice, standing in the very debate hall that sometimes was the stage for hearings on racial legislation? Perhaps Day's voice would be figured in his cuts and dovetails of maple, walnut, mahogany, poplar to make this room. Perhaps it would be in the curving recesses shaped into the lectern's detailed paneled fronts, or in the cascading wood Venetian blinds and damasked benches that he designed and implemented here. While UNC had already replaced Day's benches by 1888, his riser design still arranges the chairs into a semicircle facing the audience toward the lecterns. Day sets the stage. Perhaps his presence is further felt in light raking from the windows, shining splashes on walls through the chemical silver of this photographic print, the photographer perhaps unintentionally capturing what appears to be an aura around Day's lecterns. If so, these would be utterances we can sense that are not invisible, that may be present, but that are given to us only as the possible. Possibilities we imagine out of Day's trace archive, a handful of letters preserved by UNC, commercial photographs like this one, Day's probate documents, and the woodworks themselves. Day's presence in the room, I would argue, may also be illuminated by the discipline of art history itself, a discipline that continues to strive to hear marginalized voices by listening ever more carefully to stories possible to tell, even subjunctive or speculative stories, by taking seriously the narrative capabilities of visual details. 40 years earlier, before the Civil War, Day wrote a series of letters corresponding with white enslaver, former governor of North Carolina, and then president of UNC, David Swain. The letters to Swain are about the renovation of this debate hall for the Philanthropic and Dialectic Societies, an organization that was the precursor to the university's library. In these letters, Day's high bid of $350 won the commission. However, Swain asked Day to set up his workshop at UNC Chapel Hill for the duration of the commission, and for Day to reside in quote unquote a commodious dwelling 150 yards from the job site. Day resisted Swain's request. Quote, Day writes, You advise me to come there to do the work, but I think I can prepare the whole shelving and boxing here with the assistance of my power saws and bring it in wagons, which I have. I can select better timber here and prepare it much better," end quote. In his letter, Day desires to remain in his Milton workshop. He wants to, quote, "select better timber," to investigate carefully the grain, the stiffness, the softness in his favored, familiar wood stacks amassed and dried in his own kiln, cut from his own timberland. However, despite Day's striking preference for craft independence from Swain that I consider further along, Day's letters have been analyzed in the literature as the display of an entrepreneurial spirit and capitalist savvy. His letters are considered evidence of his ability to integrate labor, from harvested timber to finished cabinet, and his reliance on enslaved labor in that process. Historians have zeroed in on what is often seen as the Day paradox, a freeborn Black man who, according to his estate papers, was also a slaveholder. But historians might ask how the supposed Day paradox soothes white guilt by making Day scapegoat and perpetrator of the period's atrocities, freezing him into the logic of the slaveholding South, and foreclosing the transgressive and experimental possibilities that seem clearly written into his life's work. And I would be remiss here not to center the oral tradition of the Day family itself, who say that those listed as enslaved were family and friends that Day purchased out of and not into bondage. Day's ancestors had been enslaved, and he was shrouded by that terror constantly in the region of Milton. And perhaps one only need to look at Day's woodworks that visually interrupt the mid-19th century taste for Stoic interiors to see how Day's twists and turns may imply an archival elsewhere. Consider for a moment here one of Day's eccentric newel posts swirling in what was probably a plantation house in Leesburg, North Carolina. I think reducing Day's craft to his participation in a slave economy would be to greatly impoverish his complex experimentation, given his own always apparent, always imminent racial status. I take Day's preference for craft independence from Swain instead as tracing the experimentation that I see as at the heart of his woodwork. Day declares to Swain that he favors his own appearance in, as it were, like two places at once, being underneath the rolling steam of his power saw in Milton, and yet also at UNC Chapel Hill, 50 miles away, where he could measure the job site. Day therefore favors locomotion between these two places. He favors his quote unquote wagons, which I have. He favors not only his physical, but his intellectual movement across, his traversing between workshop and commission site. Day therefore participated and refused the Swain Commission, refusing UNC's demand for his proximity, and yet delivering all 4 lecterns into the UNC debate hall, into Swain's space. Day's maneuver may be important evidence of the experimentations inherent to his craft. Day knew the space between Milton and UNC, and the space between the two men all too well, a space occupied by antebellum liberty's brutal contradictions. That Day and Swain would collaborate in this campus renovation, a contradiction made even more manifest in the 50-mile stretch of rural terror that the so many plantations that Day's wagons would pass on the journey to the campus of UNC. Perhaps Day's insistence to bring the lecterns by wagon this way was his way of rendering legible on some scale these 50 miles in between them. This might have been Day's strategic experiment, what might be called Day's quote unquote survivance, Chippewa tribe Gerald Visner's term for native people's strategic refusal by participating in settler projects. Day's survivance, his refusal and participation in the Swain Commission, may be visible in the lecterns themselves. Visual details may help to show how he formed his woodworks to render legible on some scale the space between freedoms. Let's look at one of the UNC lecterns more closely. Made in 1848, its Gothic revivalism was at the forefront of European furniture design that would become more widely popular in America in the 1850s and 60s. On this lectern, notice like the series of arches running along the bottom edge of the crown molding, what in a letter to Swain, Day called the curting. There are 5 arches, for example, running along the crown molding on the front panel. Such Gothic revival forms appear in canonical American pre-Raphaelite architecture, for example, in the works of Peter Bonnet Wright and Russell Sturgis. Notice on this slide at Wright, Wright's National Academy of Design building, constructed in New York City in 1866, with lower level windows shaped much like the skirting or curting on Day's lectern. What could Day's Gothic revivalism or pre-Raphaelite architecture have to do with his survivance, that is, his subtle resistance in the forms of the Swain Commission? Well, art historians such as Sophie Linford have shown how British and American Gothic revivalism was often connected to the abolitionist movement. She writes that, quote, American pre-Raphaelites, like the architect Wright, who is believed to be an abolitionist, positioned Gothic revival architecture as a vehicle to address issues of enforced servitude, the disaffected laborer, end quote. Such abolitionist artists, architects, writers would imagine a world of ancient medieval values, a world of Gothic craftspeople who evoked to them a sense of human solidarity and dignity from laborer to priest. Day was certainly versed in Gothic revivalism, evidenced by works such as the Lectern, and Day was an abolitionist. In 1935, Day traveled to Philadelphia to attend the 5-day-long 5th Annual Convention for the Improvement of the Free People of Color in the United States. Among its many abolitionist proposals, that convention that Day attended and supported went further, theorizing forms of Black enfranchisement. This is from the conference's general notes, quote, "We claim to be American citizens and we will not waste our time with those who deny us this privilege," end quote, in 1835. Day also sent his daughter and his 2 sons to the abolitionist-led Wilbraham and Monson Academy in Massachusetts, very far from Milton, North Carolina. However, if Day's Gothic revivalism was a cipher for his abolitionism, his particular use of the style was more than a mere nod to romantic Gothic revivalist labor politics. Rather, Day's lectern may bring more direct abolitionist imagery to bear, I would argue, as a way of experimentally and subtly positioning abolitionist feeling in Swain's space. Unlike Wright's arched windows for the National Academy of Design, Day actually rounded the spear-like point of the arched window. His skirting along the crown molding therefore seems like a row of humans from chest to head. This form may suggest the abolitionist diagram printed in 1789 for the London Committee for the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, a detail of which is at upper right. Rows of people in the hold of the slave ship lie shoulder to shoulder, conveying a brutality that the British abolitionists sought to convey with this graphic, persuasive pulp clarity. Perhaps Day's skirting recalls this graphic, rows of people shoulder to shoulder. Perhaps this repeated form in the UNC debate hall would have been a subtle abolitionist experiment. I'd like to offer one more layer of survivance to Day's lectern. Each lectern is short, about 22 inches tall, chair height. So each, therefore, was meant to be what Day called a table that could accommodate a sitting speaker. Each had a chair slid into the hollow of the hidden backside. So therefore, these lecterns, more like desks, were not inert blocks, plinths upon which papers shuffle and speakers lean. Rather, each lectern invites the body of the speaker into its recess to encase and enclose part of their body. In a sense, the speaker, or at least their legs, insert into the back of the wooden form an experience of the box that might be imagined as like coffin-like. Indeed, Day's letters frequently discuss the construction of these desks as quote unquote boxed, or quote unquote the boxing of them, perhaps in allusion to their enclosure-like, their coffin-like construction. This kind of morbid boxing could have been particularly resonant with members of the UNC Debate Society. Indeed, perhaps Day himself knew that the members of the Debate Society seemed to die young. The Debate Society even had its own on-campus graveyard for the fallen members, pictured here on the right. There was much ceremony around the death of members. For example, in 1855, the Dialectic Society mourned the death of John Alexander Smith. A debate member spoke, eulogized him from Day's very lectern. Quote, "Death has again folded in his icy embrace one of our brothers. Wherefore be it resolved that while we weep for the dead, we rejoice in the manifestations he gave in his last hours, of his hope of immortality and of that light which should guide him through the dark valley of the shadow of death," end quote. In conclusion, is it my imagination that the front panel of Day's lectern, with its striking domed rectangular relief, resembles the common form of a headstone, a gravestone? Is it my imagination that these coffin box lecterns were an uncanny invocation of the UNC debaters' mortality? Day's way of reminding them that they had eulogized their own, that the quote, shadow of death in their campus graveyard was nearby. Might Day have invoked the debaters' mortality as a way of judging them before a Christian God, perhaps therefore pointing to debate members' collective guilt, indicting them? I imagine Day on a site visit to UNC for the commission, standing in this debate society graveyard, before their tombs, walking among them, asking himself how to put these gravestones into his subtle experiment in the debate hall, asking himself how to make his lecterns indict, resist, survive. Such possibilities converge in the lectern, are not invisible, perhaps can be heard even through the brutality of the archive, even voiced through visual detail. Okay.
It's wonderful. Thanks so much, Jason. We have some wonderful questions coming into the Q&A. I think for time's sake, I'm going to introduce our final panelist, and then we'll pose a question to each of the panelists at the very end. Thanks so much. Our final panelist is Amarildo Ajasse, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cologne in Germany. He earned his PhD in art history from the Ca' Foscari University of Venice. He holds an MA in sociology from the University of Turin and a licentiate in journalism from Eduardo Mondlane University in Maputo, Mozambique. His paper is entitled An Approach to Comparative Art History, Chronology Without Hierarchization as a Method. Thanks so much, Amarildo.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. And for me, it's a great pleasure to share my views or to share my reflections on the topic or the main topic of this conference. Yeah, this is a reflection that I have been doing since I have started my PhD research. But this conference had gave me an opportunity to take further my reflections, and I would like to share, discuss today how I would like to slightly or somehow contribute to within the debate of art history, and something that was to me very important, and very important because very problematic at the same time. The source of this conference was the source of inspiration to me, but my PhD dissertation also was very important, and was there because the main topic of my dissertation was the Venice Biennale, the attendance of African countries to the Venice Biennale, and since then, I had started to reflect on this topic of hierarchization in the art field. And in 2018, I had this chance to attend a conference where I had presented one chapter of my dissertation, in which I had started to discuss how the African arts is critical reviewed within the context of Venice Biennale, and I'm talking about hierarchization. Why hierarchization is important topic, and why it's important to challenge it, because the goal of my proposal today is to challenge the practice of hierarchization in the context of the field of art history. But why that is important? Because first of all, hierarchization have impact on the reception of objects and consequently on the economy of value attached to them. For example, in the case of Venice Biennale, from where the objects or from where the pavilions are, determines how the pavilion will be critical reviewed. For example, at the Venice Biennale, at the beginning, the art critics and also the main journals of art criticism, they publish a list of the must-see list of all the pavilions that the attendants or the visitors should see. And in this, one of the criteria of that guides the elaboration of this list is somehow critical or hierarchical informed, because most of the times the pavilions that the visitors are advised to see are those pavilions that are located in the main Venice Biennale venues, mostly in the Jardin della Biennale. That's why this topic was present, and also hierarchical narratives of art history have embedded this idea that the art itself, art or art movements used to emerge in the center, and then they spread themselves to the periphery. So there is this dynamic from the is something that are going from the periphery, from the center to the periphery. And this, for example, had dominated the discussion about the modern art. That's why, for example, many scholars such as Oku Ngwedzo had after elaborate the idea of other modernities, because the idea of modern art was centered on the fact that it was something related or specific for the Western context. But with these elaborations, Oku Ngwedzo, Apadurai, and others, they had challenged this concept of modern art by bringing, by at the same time challenge this idea of center periphery and bring about the other modernities. And hierarchization is also attached to the concept of chronology, because most of the chronologies, they organize objects and organize art movements according to certain criteria, and those criteria they create also this idea of that mostly when this process of chronalization is organized in a vertical perspective. So those who had arrived first or after had different values according to the meaning that we give to the after, or to those who arrived before. For example, if we start in vertical chronalization from the simple to the much complex, we will pretend to see those that are more simple as having less value, that those are more complex. So this implies a certain hierarchization of the objects or the narrative that we are creating. So this hierarchies or hierarchization is strongly attached, at least in other fields. For example, there's in the concept of that Foucault used a lot, the concept of archaeology of knowledge, and he talks about this idea of the ideas that are behind of the meanings or the understanding of the objects, and how this is somehow subverted and created a certain of hierarchies within them. And yeah, and today I will focus on comparative art history. And comparative art history to mean comparisons between different art objects, the art practice that are made in different places. Actually, in art history, one of the comparative art history is made mostly influenced by this notion of national boundaries, and these national boundaries had made the process of art, the process of the studies of art history to see and to analyze and to perceive the art and give value to the art objects, mostly by consider where the objects are from. So to throw that view was not, for example, certain objects that are made in different contexts was not possible, for example, to compare between them because, for example, African objects and let's say European objects or more contemporary objects and ancient objects. So this was so difficult to be done or to be related these objects. And today I would like to take further this concept of comparative art histories by proposing a concept that will enable or will facilitate this process of comparative art history, or maybe let's say relate objects that are from different parts of the world. Because here, by thinking about this, I have in mind the context of Venice Biennale, where artists and the pavilions from different parts of the world are there and exhibited at the same time. And it's true that there are national pavilions that are working in independent topics, but that are influenced by the edition main topic, but at the same time they are or there is the main exhibition curated by each edition artistic director. So it's very important to be able to relate these objects and also to somehow compare the exhibitions. And this is very crucial for the case of Venice Biennale because at each edition there is a jury that selects the 3 best pavilions of each edition. So it's very important to have a criteria that can enable this comparison or relation of these objects. So to my elaboration, I had been influenced by several methods, such as, for example, this global art history possibilities and commodity and politics of value. So these different theories had enabled me to be a source to me to create this concept that is more a result of my background in sociology and anthropology and also in art history. And I'm more interested on the cross boundaries between cultural models, and also for me it's very important to not consider the culture in culture or art objects in their essential definition. So that's why I came across with this create this concept that is the second time that I'm presenting publicly. This concept of art from nowhere, that is that are art objects that are not because artists and also the art historians, as I said at the beginning, they tend to consider objects by starting from where the objects are from, and also artists at the same time they are trying to even unconsciously they trying to incorporate some elements that can be connected to the place where they're from. So these objects, these artistic productions are easily connected to certain places. For example, one sees an object and can say very easily that this object is from, or the artist who made this object is from that place or that country. But what I'm proposing is, for example, an object, an art piece that is not easily connected or reconducted to a place, to a country. And I realized that this is very well connected with the idea of the definition of art of Arthur Danto, where they say that the art or the art object is something that is able to continue or to establish a certain dialogue with the other objects that came before its creation. So I think it's very important to me and to what I'm trying to, this concept of art nowhere, to find out, or to those objects, those artworks that are not easily connected to certain parts of the world, but at the same time are able to create a dialogue with all the objects that came before them. And for example, this is my first example, just to show. I have 4 examples to share with you today. And this is the first example. I had decided to note, for example, here in my slides, I didn't include the artist's country or where the artist is from, but just to, because, for example, when we see this installation, this installation, this national pavilion that was in one of the editions of the Venice Biennale, we can see this pavilion, we can see this installation, and we cannot, for example, easily identify or define or say where the artist is from. Maybe we can easily do it if we have the catalog of an exhibition material that can help us to do this, to have this information. But for example, this object or this installation can establish a very fruitful dialogue with other installations, with other artworks that came before or that had been made before. For example, one object that, for example, is very interesting, that that is the first time that I realized that, for example, this Edson Chagas photography installation can have established a dialogue with Andy Horrell Brill box, for example, and that is very important. I'm going to end in a few minutes. And the second example is this also other sculpture that was displayed in Venice Biennale in 2007. Maybe we can guess from the names or from, but I think that's, and this concept of art from nowhere enables us to create a dialogue between artworks from different parts of the world without put them in hierarchical perspective, but in terms of how they are able to establish a dialogue with the objects that came before. I have 2 more examples, but if I don't have any more time, I can just show. This is other example, all of our liaison. And all the examples I chose are from the Venice Biennial pavilions or artworks or performers or art projects that have been displayed there. And so thank you for that. I hope to in this conference I can have more insights to continue to develop this concept that I'm trying to create. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd like to invite all the panelists to join us with video. I'm seeing some incredible connections between the discussions. There are many questions in our Q&A, and I'm going to try to pose one to each guest. And we just have about 10 minutes left, so we'll try to go as quickly as possible. I think I will start as Adekunle, are you able to turn your video on? Okay, I'll just move on very quickly. Jason, we have a question for you on methodology. And it looks like, let me just take a quick look. I'll read this for you. I have a methodological question for Jason. I apologize if it is poorly worded and comes off as insensitive. I was interested in your analysis of the photo in the beginning and the idea of absence of objects telling us information. Based on this, do you think there's a potential in more experimental contemporary theories like Jane Bennett's or OOO, object-oriented ontology, that think about the way it would mean for an object to speak in the way you suggested? Or do you think the emphasis for such sensitive topics should be on the historical context, as you say, on the scapegoating of Thomas Day? I'll pose that over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. I posted a response in the question, but I thought it was a great question, and it helps me to think about it as well. You know, I think I don't take, I think I don't take the voice, as I wrote, like the voicing of Thomas Day in the debate hall so literally as object-oriented ontology does. That there's a literal ontology, there's a literal presence or animacy in the object, and the various philosophical iterations of that I think of it less literally and more as more loosely as a kind of cultural voicing, social or political voicing that is something that I derive from, and for example, like Brian Wolf's essay about voicing. But I also like take some liberty for sure that I'm like taking from the methods of like Saidiya Hartman and Venus in Two Acts and Wayward Lives, if you're familiar with that work. So like really trying to do the work of fabulating storytelling when the archive really has these gaping absences and requires the kind of in a lot of ways, the creative voice of the scholar as well, and trying to get comfortable in that space.
Great, thank you so much. Adekunle, a question for you. Thinking on visualizing history and architectural history in 2060, and looking at such cities as Kyiv, Aleppo, and other cities prone to natural and man-made disasters, we're observing destroyed architecture in our present day. Do we know of any active steps by present-day historians to proactively save the current-day architecture, either digitally or otherwise, or to have them for posterity in the future?
Thank you very much for that question. I presently don't know of any steps so far, but the onus is on the art and architectural historians in the locations to preserve the architectural history. You know, in other places too, there are natural and man-made activities that threaten architecture and art. For example, some historic buildings are suddenly demolished for some other modern or contemporary development, which should not be. So for us as arts and architectural historians all over the world, we should document our history, for we know not when natural or man-made disasters may strike. So it's something we should actively do all over the world. within our environment, we should engage actively in researching, in documenting, even if we don't have the time to do comprehensive studies, documenting them in terms of videos, in terms of pictures, in terms of taking down the plans, exhuming the archival documents, they are very important.
Thank you so much. Amarildo, a question for you. How would you envision structuring an introductory art history survey course in a de-hierarchized, object-based manner?
Yeah.
And I'll just ask you to unmute when you have a chance.
Can you hear me now?
Great.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think that I don't have an immediate answer, but this is something that I will work on and will take further my reflections on this concept. But I think one of the ways that comes to my mind right now is how the objects are able to establish a certain dialogue between each other. So from there, create a curriculum, and and I will elaborate, and thank you so much, because this will be useful for my reflection. And yeah, I really appreciate this question. Yeah, and so sorry. And yeah, we can stay in touch. Maybe when I will have further elaboration, I may share with the one who made this question. Yeah, and to others, sorry. Yeah, but it's very, very important question, and yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. A quick follow-up, we just have a couple of minutes left. Jason, also maybe a training question. If art historians in the future are doing more speculative or critical fabulation, how do you think our training is going to have to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it's an awesome question that like requires like committees. But you know, like my initial thought, or something I at least think about, is the way that a course or a specific kind of graduate seminar, for example, on objectivity might be really helpful. So the way that our historians have attachments to kind of scientific methodologies, or like ways of kind of trying to prove things that come from the history of the field, that derives in part from like anthropology, early anthropology, right? In this way that we can convert objects into these kind of playgrounds for measurement and proof that kind of we learn how to kind of detach ourselves from those ways of thinking about objects, and you know, think about our own subjectivity a little bit more, that our own imagination actually, you know, doesn't have to be metered, or doesn't have to be like a critical distance between the art historian and the object, that proximity actually is like a very human thing, and to kind of lean into the imaginative capabilities of an art historian's encounter with an object. So maybe like a seminar on that, like a creative kind of thing. But yeah, it's hard. I don't know. It's such a good question.
It's a great response. Thank you. Jamie, I'd like to pose the final question to you. And I just would thank everybody, these wonderful connections between hierarchy and flattening out the hierarchy. I was interested in art from nowhere, tying into Jamie's art from everywhere. And I was wondering, Jamie, if you could take this final question. Someone writes, I really enjoyed this very informative presentation. You mentioned at one point a more linear model of engagement among artists, curators, auction houses, and collectors. Can you say more about the transition to a linear from a hierarchical model? and perhaps expand on why Christie's in particular is so involved in NFTs versus other auction houses like Sotheby's?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think the linear model of communication in these collectives is a bit reflective of the blockchain itself. So if you remember the proof of work method, everyone has a copy of that info. So because it's also democratically based, I find that a lot of these communities are literally linear, just based off of that congeniality. Often these NFTs will also, or NFT collectors will also hold giveaways and vote on the next collection that is dropped. So there's that aspect that leads to that more linear setup rather than a hierarchy. And in terms of why Christie's in particular is so involved with NFTs versus other auction houses, I think Sotheby's also had gotten involved. There's also other institutions. The name escapes me at this moment, but there is one museum in Europe that they generated NFTs similar to like a postcard in your gift shop that would generate revenue for the museum. But in specifics to Christie's, I think the reason why they started to dive into this whole NFT scene is for two reasons. So one, to introduce NFT technology to old money buyers. For the most part, they seem to have been hesitant, and rightly so, because technically speaking, the first NFT was produced in 2012. And this was well before the Ethereum blockchain came out. So I suspect that with all these updates and everything and these improvements, NFTs really became popular in the last 2 years. So that's one reason why I think NFTs showed up in Christie's specifically. And I think the other reason is also to increase their outreach to more demographics. So because the wallet does not have any requirements of who the owner is or the holder, there's a lot of appeal for younger audiences and people who are not from well-financed backgrounds to engage with this sort of market, because again, you don't have to come from old money. You don't necessarily need thousands of dollars in your bank account to buy a Bored Ape or something. And because of this sort of anonymity, there's this NFT project that happened in, I think, Thailand, where it ended up raising a lot of people out of poverty. And so those specific individuals, they ended up generating revenue so much that the Thailand government actually started taxing them. So I think that's the two reasons essentially why NFTs are all of a sudden relevant to institutions, but whether or not those their integrity is well put, I'm not sure, but those are the two reasons I would say.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the college, I'd like to thank you all for these fantastic presentations. We look forward to following your scholarship, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this morning. Thanks again. This will conclude our morning panel. Bye-bye, everyone.